Hello, hi everyone. Welcome to the Teaching English webinar for teacher educators. My name is Shirin Soyoz and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you all so much for joining today's live event. This webinar is with Veitch as she explores effective collaborative strategies for teaching other subjects through English. As usual, before we start the session, I'd like to share a number of quick housekeeping reminders with you. While waiting, please share with us in the Q&A where you are from. If you work in pre-service teacher education, type pre-service. If you work in in-service, type in-service in the Q&A. This session is being recorded and a recording of the webinar will be available on Teaching English in the next couple of days. The link to the certificate will be provided in the thank you email that you'll receive tomorrow. Finally, you will have a chance to ask questions during the session. Please use the Q&A to ask our presenter your questions. We'll be using the chat for announcements. So let me introduce you our presenter today. Anne is British Council's Global Lead for English as a Language of Learning and Teaching and English within Multilingual Education, responsible for the British Council's global program, English in a Multilingual World. She is the author of the British Council's Perspective on English in Higher Education, English Medium, and co-author of a global mapping of English medium instruction in higher education. Based in Scotland, Anne has worked in English language teaching, teacher education, academic and program management for 23 years. Her interests are inclusion, equity within English as a language of learning and teaching context, multilingual pedagogies, and global Englishes. So very interesting. Hello, Anne. So over to you to start today's session.
Hello everyone, and greetings from a very cold and miserable Scotland. Today we're in the middle of storm season here, so it's very wet. The wind is blowing and it's very cold, and we're bracing for another storm tonight. Today I'm going to be looking at how teacher educators can enhance learning and teaching in English medium education or English as a language of learning and teaching contexts. Next slide, please, Mark. We're going to begin with a quiz today, so I'd like you to put your answers in the Q&A. It's an acronyms quiz. This is a field which is full of acronyms, so please have a look at these acronyms and see if you can describe what they are in the Q&A. Brilliant, some answers coming through now. Yeah, lots of good correct answers. Fantastic. A lot of you have answered LoLT and EMI and ESP and CLIL. MOI, anyone? Yes. Fantastic. You obviously know all your stuff. Next slide, please, Mark. So these are the acronyms that we've just looked at. So language of learning and teaching. You could have a language of learning and teaching if you embrace a more multilingual approach, or the language of learning and teaching if you embrace a more monolingual approach. In the case of English as a language of learning and teaching, it would mean a more English-only approach. Medium of instruction, a lot of people got this correct. It means the same thing as language of learning and teaching, but it's maybe viewed as a more teacher-focused interpretation. more focused just on classroom interaction, whereas language of learning and teaching could be said to describe wider educational functions, such as the language of curriculum, resources, and assessment. A lot of you got EMI, which is English Medium Instruction. We also have EME, which is English Medium Education. They describe the same thing, so the use of English to teach academic content. And at British Council, we prefer the term EME as a more holistic term. CLIL, I saw a lot of correct answers with this, particularly from our participants in Europe, where CLIL is very popular, content and language integrated learning. MLE, I didn't see anyone answer this one, is multilingual education. So the use of multiple linguistic repertoires and multilingual pedagogies. ESP, a lot of people again answered this one correctly. So it's English for specific purposes. So English for specific disciplinary functions and literacies. There's lots of different kinds of ESP. You might be familiar with another acronym, EAP, for English for academic purposes, or ESAP, English for specific academic purposes. EES is English as a subject, so the teaching of and learning of English language, and it's where most of us come from in the field of VLT. Next slide, please, Mark. So I'll give you a quick overview of the session today. It's divided into 2 sections, and we'll aim to pause and discuss any questions or comments which you have between the 2 sections. I'm going to start by looking at the who, what and why of English as a language of learning and teaching, what it is, the different forms it can take, why it happens, and why it's something that we should consider as English language teacher educators. We'll pause for some questions and discussion. So please note down your questions while I'm talking and put them in the Q&A, and we'll come to them in that session. We'll then look at some challenges and opportunities and potential solutions to issues in English as a language of learning and teaching contexts. And I'll hopefully keep this section short so we have more time to discuss your questions and comments after that. Next slide, please. So what is English as a language of learning and teaching? So very basically, English as a language of learning and teaching describes the use of English to learn and teach. It does what it says on the tin. It describes the medium of instruction. And as such, it could include English as a subject, but it's usually used to describe situations where other academic subjects or content, such as maths and science and humanities, are learned and taught in or through English in contexts where English is an additional language, i.e. English is not the everyday language of communication for the majority of the population. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly look at why it happens. Understanding why English as a language of learning and teaching happens is important to us as teachers and teacher educators, as it helps us understand where we might have agency, where we might be able to influence, and where we might have choice. So the choice of language of learning and teaching is usually taken at government level. This might be national government level or local government level, or a combination of 2. Where educational institutions have autonomy, for example, often in universities or in private schools, language of learning and teaching and language and education policy decisions might be made at a more institutional level. Wherever the decision happens, it's not made in isolation. Choice of language of learning and teaching will be influenced by many different stakeholders. So parents might have a say, teachers will have a say, students may have a say, wider society might influence the decision. It's also influenced by bigger factors and forces, often beyond our control. And these big factors include history. So a country might adopt or use English as a language of learning and teaching because it has a legacy of British colonialism and English is part of its history. This is the case in countries like India and Nigeria and South Africa. Politics might also be influential in language of learning and teaching decisions. So for example, in many multilingual or multi-ethnic societies, for example, Rwanda or Namibia, English is chosen as a language of learning and teaching as a means of nation building, the old notion of one language, one nation. and English is often seen as a neutral choice, even though language is never neutral, as opposed to local languages, which might be attached to different ethnic groups. In many cases, there's this economic argument made for the use of English as a language of learning and teaching. It's seen as a way to develop English proficiency, and as such, it might help a country or institution compete or collaborate on a national or international stage. It might enable globalization and internationalization. It will bring economic and resulting social benefits to a country, institution, or individual. And these big factors also influence stakeholders. So English as a language of learning and teaching is, for example, sometimes a very popular choice for aspirational parents, or for governments. It's often seen as a bit of a vote winner. English as a language of learning and teaching, it should be noticed as a very contested and controversial model of education. It's driven by complex factors, some of which we've looked at very, very briefly, and many of which are beyond the control of us as teachers and as teacher educators. We come in usually at the very end of the process and are there to deliver and implement the language of learning policy decision. And because these policy decisions are often influenced by many different factors, language is often forgotten in that mix. Next slide, please. So what different forms can English as a language of learning and teaching take? The field in which I work is full of acronyms and full of different expressions and terms and approaches, and I use language of learning and teaching and English as a language of learning and teaching as a bit of an all-embracing term, encompassing lots of different approaches. This is a continuum of approaches focused on language and approaches focused on content. It's a continuum you might have seen before. It's based on one by an author called Met. There's one very similar by two authors, Thompson and McKinley, and there's one by Airy. And it looks at approaches focus, moving from more language-focused approaches through to more content-focused approaches to English as a language of learning and teaching. And by going back to some of the acronyms we looked at earlier, you can see at the content-focused end, we have EME, where teaching and learning focuses on content, and there is little or no explicit focus on language, through to CLIL approaches, where there is a dual or balanced approach to developing content knowledge and language proficiency, through to more language-focused teaching, English as a subject, where the aims are for language learning. In terms of us as teacher educators, it's really useful to think about the teachers using these approaches, who they are, what their skills are, what their priorities are, what their needs are, in order to understand how we as teacher educators can better support them. Next slide, please. So I've taken just two of these teachers, one that you should be very familiar with as English language teacher educators, the English as a subject teacher, and the English medium education teacher, on the two different spectrums of the continuum. So let's look first and think about the English as a subject teacher. As I said, someone we're probably more familiar with as English language teacher educators. They're language specialists. Their role is to teach language. The students are learners of English, and they're more likely to use language teaching pedagogies, which tend to be more student-focused and communicative. In comparison, teachers using English medium are usually content specialists. They're maths or science or humanities teachers, and their role is to teach content. Their relationship to English is different. They use English as a tool to teach, and they're users of English rather than teachers of English. They may use more content-focused pedagogies, which may be more teacher-centered. They're focused on transmitting content knowledge rather than explicitly developing language skill. So the hats teachers wear in these contexts are very different. Depending on your context, every context is very different. This may be one teacher, or it may be two different teachers, or teachers may be moved between the two roles depending on their job. Next slide, please. So given this, you may ask, why does English as a language of learning English as a language of learning and teaching matter to English language educators? Teachers, like EME teachers using English medium, may not even view themselves as language teachers. They're content focused. So are they really anything to do with us as English language teacher educators? I would say yes, they are. And there's a couple of factors worth considering in this. Firstly, English as a language of learning and teaching has grown significantly and spread significantly globally, making it pretty inevitable or very likely that English language teacher educators will need to engage with it at some point in their career. Secondly, and this touches more on our moral obligation as educators, English as a language of learning and teaching has far-reaching and potentially more significant impacts, particularly potentially negative impacts on teaching and learning as a whole. As educators, we want to see the teachers that we work with succeed, with an end goal that students succeed and have positive learning outcomes. In non-English as a language of learning and teaching, content teaching environments, if students don't succeed in English, this is not the end of the world. They fail in one part of their education, English as a subject. If students who are forced or choose to learn in environments where English is used to teach academic subjects other than English, if they don't succeed in English, this impacts across the board and impacts the whole of their education. They might lack understanding of the subjects that are taught in English. They can't engage in the curriculum. They fail exams, not just in English, but in all subjects taught through English. Often they end up dropping out of school or have to repeat grades. And it has much bigger impacts on society as a whole because of this. For English as a subject teachers, the teachers that we usually work with as English language teacher educators in these environments, it becomes vitally important they are able to effectively develop students' cognitive academic language proficiency, which you might have heard referred to as CALP, and in later stages of education, their English disciplinary literacies to enable them to succeed in English as a language of learning and teaching context. So teaching English as a subject in English as a language of learning and teaching context, even for English teachers, is very different. It presents a challenge to both English language teachers and content teachers, and it requires both kinds of teachers and the different roles that they play to diversify their skill set and gain experience in other areas. We look a little bit more at these challenges later, but I'd like to pause at this point and take any questions or comments that you have.
Thank you for sharing your insights. And so we will open the floor for questions from our audience. So we will have more opportunities. One of the questions from Sarina. So what is the impact of language of learning and teaching in English language teachers?
Like I said, I think it does have a big impact. If you're in an environment where other subjects are taught through English, I think there's additional pressures on English language teachers and English language teacher educators to help and support and fill gaps that you might have in content teaching and English proficiency in content teaching. You need to develop, like I said, students' ability to study through and in English. So there's additional pressures on English language teachers in that way as well. So for me, it does have quite profound impacts, not just on content teaching, but also on English language teaching.
Thank you. And so there are lots of questions, comments about the recording as well. So the recording will be shared on our Teaching English website. So Ogundimo asks, how can educators who don't teach English language benefit from this session? So I think it might be also useful as general knowledge right? And so what would you say?
Yeah, I think we need to have shared understanding. Language is something that impacts every kind of learning. Every learning experience is a language learning experience. So I think for subject teachers, for content teachers, for math, science, humanities teachers, if they're working in an environment where English is a language of learning and teaching, there's commonalities that we need to look at together as English language specialists and content subject specialists. So I'm using this session as an opportunity to open up the dialogue. So a lot of this is very new. English as a language of learning and teaching, like I said, has expanded quite rapidly, quite recently. So ways of working, research, insight and evidence is quite new in this area. So a lot of what we should be doing is raising awareness of some of the issues and helping to set up support systems that can help teachers both of content and of language.
Do you think any language other than English could be globally medium, medium of instruction in the future?
Languages have lifespans, don't they? I bet if you spoke to an ancient Roman and asked the same question about Latin, they would have said, no way, Latin will be the language of the world forever. But yes, I think languages change, society changes. At the minute we use English as an international language. It's a language of communication and education. It's a language of communication for business, for science, for technology, but things can change. Maybe I point you in the direction of our Future of English research that we've just published that looks at where English is going and where it might be going in the future.
And Lloyd asks, in what ways does the language of learning and teaching contribute to promoting cultural sensitivity and understanding in educational environments?
That's a really difficult question. I think English as a language of learning and teaching, there's a dark side to it. And by that I mean it's sometimes it can be viewed as the Englishization of education and the elimination of local language and local culture. It can also increase cultural exchange. So if you have a common language shared among people, then they're more able to exchange ideas. They're more able to physically exchange with people, with counterparts. So it's for me a double-edged sword. There's pros to English as a language of learning and teaching, promoting culture, and there's very negative elements to it. But I think you can ensure that English as a language of learning and teaching can be introduced and implemented in such a way that you acknowledge English just as a language, not as the language. And you look at integrating multilingual pedagogies within English as a language of learning and teaching.
So also in that respect, teachers' competence is also important. So Joshua asks, what key guidance principles can be given to help English as a medium instruction content teachers who are concerned to support their students' English language development alongside their content knowledge and competencies?
That is a huge question. And I'm going to look at that in the next section, if that's okay.
Sure. Okay, thank you so much for your questions. So we will have more in-session Q&As. So let's continue. And then thank you so much, Anne, for your comprehensive answers.
Okay, so I'd like to briefly look at some of the challenges and opportunities that English as a language of learning and teaching presents for English as a subject teachers and for content teachers using English as a language of learning and teaching. For English as a subject teachers and teacher educators, these are very similar. So for English as a subject, teachers and teacher educators have separated out the skills that you would assume that they would already have. So language proficiency and pedagogical skills appropriate to the teaching and learning of language. However, I think it's worth noting that in English as a language of learning and teaching environments, like I said earlier, there will be additional and added pressure on English language teachers and English language teacher educators to have that required language proficiency and pedagogical skill. A lot rides on their ability to prepare students for learning in or through English, or to prepare teachers to teach in or through English. But we know, however, that in many cases, English teachers and English teacher educators might lack that essential English proficiency or pedagogical skill. Along with this added pressure, English teachers and teacher educators might see a change in their role. They might be required to support content teachers and teacher educators or provide quick language fixes. They might be required to develop some disciplinary literacy in order to help students develop the skills they need to learn, for example, math, science through English. And this learning new things or branching out into new territories is always a bit of a blend of opportunity and challenge. All of this put together might impact on teachers and teacher educators' professional confidence. In many contexts, teacher education for subject teachers doesn't accommodate or address issues around language of learning and teaching. And subject teachers often have little or no preparation to teach in or through English, with professional development for teaching in or through English often solely focused on English language proficiency. So for English medium teachers, there are similar issues in role and status. If students' language proficiency levels are not sufficient to learn in or through English, the content teacher might find themselves becoming more of an untrained, unspecialised language teacher. Teachers teaching their subject through in English might have limited English proficiency, and this combined with a different set of pedagogical skills, the need for a different set of pedagogical skills, may mean that the teachers no longer able to transmit their content knowledge effectively to students. So you might have a subject teacher who is taught for many years in a language that's familiar to them. They're highly proficient in their field. They're able to teach effectively in their own language. Suddenly who's forced to teach their subject through English and really struggles. And this all can have an impact, huge impacts on professional confidence. As I said, it's quite often language proficiency, which is focused on as a major challenge for teachers teaching through or in English, but we shouldn't ignore the importance of pedagogy. Teaching through in English is not just business as usual in another language, which is often the way it's treated within education systems. Teaching through in English requires a very different specialist set of pedagogies in order to be effective. And to work English as a language of learning and teaching policies require English language teachers and subject teachers using English to work together effectively to ensure good learning outcomes for students. And it's this solution to many of the challenges mentioned here that I'd like to focus on in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So as I said, the importance of collaboration. I should mention that the challenges and opportunities and potential solutions to issues in English as a language of learning and teaching environments are always very context specific, but I'm focusing on collaboration as a more general theme. And as I also said, this is a new field. It's something that that's developing, so the answers aren't all there. But collaboration and the coming together of content and language is very important, and it's something that's formalized in some approaches in English as a language of learning and teaching. For example, English CLIL looks at how you bring together content and language. But in many English as a language of learning and teaching contexts, it's not something that's formalized. Collaboration, although I'm putting forward a great idea, in many contexts is really not easy. You have a lot of logistical challenges. There might be wider challenges around the educational infrastructure and framework, which also need to be overcome. My first point's quite straightforward. So in English as a language of learning and teaching contexts, there's a need for collaboration between English language educators and subject teacher educators. If we're not talking already, we need to start talking to one another. And professional development for subject teachers needs to, using English needs to move beyond quite a narrow focus on English language proficiency. As we've briefly looked at, there are many issues around roles and status and professional identity in English as a language of learning and teaching context. And as teacher educators, it's important that we work with both kinds of teachers to establish a base for collaboration. This involves both parties understanding what the other brings to the table so that neither feels they need to justify their credibility or value. Support is a word which is used a lot in these contexts. So English language specialists supporting their subject specialist counterparts. I think we need to be very careful about that notion of support and that it doesn't encourage stereotypes of language teachers as low-level technicians or reinforce hierarchies between different kinds of teachers. I think there's a lot of elements where we need to establish common understanding, and this is a very incomplete list. So I've mentioned two here. We need common understanding of how English as a language of learning and teaching is interpreted, and the roles different kinds of teachers have. English as a language of learning and teaching by its very nature encourages the development of a multilingual educational environment. And I think this provides real opportunity for language and subject teachers to come together and develop their multilingual pedagogical skills and their ability to use language supportive approaches to ensure better student learning outcomes. So like I said, this is a very short and incomplete list. I'm going to stop there again and invite more questions and comments and discussion around this.
One question about diverse linguistic backgrounds. For example, Lloyd asks, in a country with diverse linguistic backgrounds like Philippines, how can educators effectively navigate the challenges associated with selecting an inclusive language of learning and teaching? So linguistic diversity can present both opportunities and challenges. What strategies would you recommend for teacher educators to effectively manage linguistic diversity?
Again, it's quite context specific. I think starting with multilingual pedagogies and understanding what that actually means. We talk a lot about translanguaging and code switching, but it's understanding how that plays out in a classroom. And I think that's equally important for English as subject teachers, where often we take a very monolingual approach to teaching English as a subject, as it is for content teachers. But I think you start with the very basics. You start by looking at understanding the linguistic makeup of students in the classroom, how they use language, how you use language yourself as a teacher, valuing those languages, giving those languages space within your classroom. A lot of this depends on whether the language and education policy allows for that. In many contexts it doesn't, so it's very context specific what you can do, what you're able to do, and how far you can push more content focused EMI English only approaches to a more multilingual approach and being more inclusive. But a lot, like I said, we don't have control over. Language policy is influenced by a lot of different factors, and language policy often still takes a very monolingual approach to language learning and teaching in and through languages.
We had another question about translanguaging. Do we have guidance for using translanguaging in principled ways for um, EMI content instruction? But I think you have answered this one. Do you have anything to add for this?
I think it was a question somebody's raised about higher education. Translanguaging in a principled way, that's a really good expression, which I think comes from the great Ernesto Macaro. Translanguaging and multilingual pedagogies in higher education may be a little bit more difficult because of the content load that lecturers have to transmit to their students, and integrating multilingual pedagogies, or even integrating a more language focused EMI, is quite controversial. You have a movement called ICLHE, which is about integrated language and content in higher education. There's lots of debates still happening about this in further and higher education. It's very complicated. Like I said, it's not just, it's about the content load that lecturers need to deliver to their students. You might have issues with international students, and a huge variety of languages in the classroom that may make multilingual pedagogies more difficult or easier to use. Yeah, none of these questions are fully answered, and I don't think I can answer that in a couple of sentences, how you translanguage in a principled way. But I think it's an interesting way to look at it, and I like Ernesto Macaro's use of that principled and meaningful way. But I think a lot of it is about establishing that baseline understanding about what translanguaging is and how it can be used in the classroom. Because I think many of us understand the theory behind it, but it's translating that theory into the classroom.
And you mentioned collaboration, the importance of collaboration. Abbas has a question: in a class managed in collaboration, do you see the content teacher supporting the language teacher or vice versa?
Tricky one. Like I said, I'm not keen on the word support. It kind of creates a hierarchy, but I don't know how else to express it. I don't know if there's a better way to express it. For me, it's collaboration. So you start on an equal footing. You're supporting each other in different ways, and it's about understanding what your skill sets are, where you can develop, how you can help each other. But like I said, support sometimes for me is a difficult word because it sets that hierarchy, and I think there's already enough hierarchies within education, and I think particularly in this area we need to start from a position of equality. But yes, I think we talk about English teachers supporting content teachers, but I think it's also the other way around. I've mentioned very briefly the concept of disciplinary literacy. If you're teaching, say for example, your education system, maths and science are taught through English. So as an English teacher in that context, you'd have to have some knowledge of maths and some knowledge of science, the languages they use, the processes that are used, the teaching methods that are used in order to tailor your teaching to that context. At all times in these contexts, if you go back to that continuum, we're all moving along back and forward along that continuum. You might start life as an English as a subject teacher, things change and you move further to a content approach. But yeah, and I think teachers in these situations need to be ultimately flexible.
Thank you, Anne. What about school leaders, the role of school leaders? What can school leaders do to contribute to this collaboration?
School leaders, depending on context again, if they're able, they can really support this process. So I mentioned some of the challenges around, I just mentioned logistics. So you might have timetabling issues that impact on the people's ability to collaborate, and that's somewhere where school leaders can come in. I think school leaders looking at flexible language policy, if they're able to in their context, is really important as well. So I think, yeah, school leaders have a big part to play in this. But again, it's about raising awareness of these issues among school leaders, and that teaching in and through English is not just business as usual, that it's a difficult thing to do, and it requires investment, resource, but that needs to be recognised at a school level, but also at a government level, whether that's local government, national government. You need to resource these changes effectively for them to work.
Okay, thank you, Anne. We also, I mean, what do we as English language teacher educators bring to the table? So do you have any comments about our role as teacher educators, and also the supportive leadership between the school and teacher education institutions, maybe inside the school or support from outside?
Well, like I said, if you're an EME, if you're a teacher teaching through EME, EMI, you're not likely, your teacher educator is likely to be a subject teacher educator, and there's no crossover between it. English language teacher educators are sometimes brought in to improve language proficiency, but I think there's collaboration among teachers, but there's a big piece of work around collaboration among teacher educators. We don't collaborate at all enough in a lot of contexts. It's a very separate groups of people, and I think there needs to be more collaboration at that level as well. If we're expecting it of teachers to collaborate together, you also need to expect it of your educators to collaborate together. But again, there's lots and lots of challenges to doing that. It's easier said than done.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Well, collaboration is the key then, in that case, having this across the school. I mean, as a school culture, school leaders have a role here. And yes, the context, it's a very context sensitive issue, and yes.
I think so. It's quite difficult in this area because every country's language and education policy is different. Every institution implements that policy or decides themselves on a policy, and it is very, very context specific.
Well, thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your insights. And thank you so much, our colleagues, for your questions. So I just want to ask one more about bilingual education. Could you please talk a little bit about that? So because there are some common areas. So in terms of the teaching, language of learning and teaching, how it
bilingual education, sometimes there's different interpretations of bilingual education. It sometimes fits in, if you remember back to that continuum that I showed, it fits into the kind of immersion focus. But you might have bilingual education where it's dual bilingual, so you might have subjects taught in 2 languages. You might have teaching in 1 language and assessment in another. So there's lots of different interpretations of bilingual education. It's a whole session on its own.
Thank you. Yeah, what about the future, and how do you see the future of all these concepts in the future? Because these
I would like us to stop using so many acronyms in this field. There's a lot of terminology, and you can get very bogged down in terminology and definitions and arguing about what different things are. And I think often in those arguments, the actual practical implementation is lost. So I would like us to look at how these things are practically implemented, I know we have to be able to describe them, but sometimes it's quite yeah, you get bogged down in it. But the future, I think, this is Anasta Manacaro, again, one of my favorite academics in this field, has described this, the spread of English as a language of learning and teaching as an unstoppable bullet train that's already left the station. And this is something that's happening. It's going to keep happening. And it's something that we have to work with as teachers and as teacher educators. You can't stick your head in the sand and ignore it. It's growing, it's spreading, and that's what it is. We have to deal with it. But I hope in the future there's more inclusion. We're able to approach it more equitably and with an eye to inclusion, because I think that's often been missing in language of learning and teaching policies.
Yes, absolutely agree with you. So thank you so much, Anne, for this session. So in terms of the technological advances, will technology make a difference, do you think, in that sense? How will it affect this process in this changing world and contexts?
I'm not a technology expert, which is why Mark, my colleague, had to do my slides for me today. I think it will have big impact. The whole AI translation, will have a big impact on education in the future. Maybe it will ease the burden, or especially for content teachers who are using English as a language of learning and teaching. It might ease the language burden on them. I hope, but technology sometimes increases workloads. So I hope it eases some of the burden on teachers and facilitates the learning and teaching process rather than becoming a burden. But I'm a pessimist, so I always think the worst is going to happen.
We hope things will be more positive, more helpful, and we'll collaborate more and have more inclusion, and technology also will facilitate. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And so, we hope you found the session useful and picked up some useful ideas to reflect in your training contexts. So there are still lots of questions coming. And so we still have time. So one more question. One concern I have from EMI teachers is about pronunciation. Is that common? Josh asks.
Yes, could you say that again?
One concern I hear from English as a medium instruction teachers is about pronunciation. So is that a common concern that you have seen in different contexts?
I'm a real advocate for global Englishes. I don't speak English with a what we call a prestige accent. I have a regional English accent, and I think we've got to be accepting. English is a international language. For me, there's no correct pronunciation. My assessment colleagues are going to hate me here, but I prefer that comprehensibility is more important. If you can understand what somebody is saying, that's more important than they're saying it correctly. I think you've got to accept that English is an international language, and there's a lot of different varieties of English, and there's a quality in those varieties. One is not more superior than the other.
Yes, it might be a barrier if we are too rigid. And what about adult learning through so is there evidence of enhancement in adult learning through EME? So I keep English as a medium of instruction, adult learning through English as a medium of instruction.
I'm not sure what this question's asking. There's a lot of claims around English medium. about how it may, or how it may enhance your English language proficiency, but there isn't really concrete evidence to say that it does. If you look at English medium in higher education, there's a couple of studies that have been done recently that show that if you enter an EME program, enter an EME program with a high level of English proficiency, you're more likely to succeed in that program. But there's very little evidence to show that English medium, so teaching and learning through English, actually enhances your English proficiency. It's one of the, it's always claimed that we're introducing English medium, so our students are going to speak better English, but there's very little evidence to back that up. If you look at English medium in basic education, there's some evidence, for example, in Hong Kong and Singapore, where you've got highly resourced contexts where a lot of money and resources pumped into education systems to make them work, that it may have benefits for English language proficiency. But if you look at a lot of other contexts where English as a language of learning and teaching is used, for example, in a lot of African countries, there's very little evidence to show that it improves English language proficiency, and in fact it can have a detrimental impact on learning. So the evidence is mixed. This is a very new field and there needs to be more evidence. If we're going to say English medium, we're introducing English medium to improve language proficiency, there needs to be evidence to back that up, but currently there isn't.
So more research is needed in that field.
Definitely.
Okay, so well, let me check if there are any other questions. So Gary Mottram here saying language teachers can support content teachers with pedagogy. What do you think about this? So yeah, we have a role then in that case. But yeah.
I think it's dual. I think, like I said, we don't use enough multilingual pedagogies within English as a subject teaching, and I think that's a shared pedagogy that you could develop together. Again, I go back to my comments around supporting and how it might create a kind of hierarchical structure. And I think if we ask content teachers to become language teachers in their pedagogy, that's not, it doesn't work. It's not appropriate in what they're doing. So I think that there's understanding the pedagogical needs and the pedagogical wants of the students and the pedagogical needs of the class and the institution, and adapting that. But for me, there's one area where we could work on pedagogy together, where we're both pretty poor in English language teaching and content teaching, and that's the development of multilingual pedagogies. And for me, that's a good way to bring people together. When you have a lack of knowledge and skill of both parties, perhaps that's a good way to start working collaboratively.
So yes, as a school policy, perhaps this is a nice starting point then for school leaders, for teacher educators.
Yeah, if you're able to do it, a lot of school leaders and teachers are stuck in situations where they have to teach through English and they have to teach only in English, and they're not allowed to encourage the development of a full linguistic repertoire of their students, and that's a policy decision. And then you're kind of stuck, other than putting pressure on policymakers and decision makers to change.
Well, thank you so much, Anne. So let's yes, we will wrap up the session. So we have received really lots of questions. Thank you everyone for your questions as well. So the recording of the webinar and the slides will be available in Teaching English in the next couple of days. And don't forget to subscribe to our monthly newsletter for teacher educators and register for our next webinar in February. How can teacher educators use the community of inquiry framework to support teacher learning? So We very much hope to see you all again in our future sessions. So thank you once again, and thank you once again, Anne, for sharing your expertise. And it's not a very easy topic, but you have explained it so clearly for us. And yes, this perspective is, I think, is the right way to look at these issues. So thank you once again, and hope to see you again in our future sessions as well.
Thank you. I hope the little information that I've given has opened up some paths of thought, and yeah. But like I said, it's a very new field. It's developing, and yeah, it's finding our way through the issues and through the challenges and through the opportunities that present itself.
We hope so. We hope it will grow even more in the right way. Okay.